Good morning, everyone. You all look wide awake after those parties last night, huh? This is short-term rentals in the right place, and I am Linda Cavanaugh, Mayor of the Town of Fountain Hills. I want to call this meeting to order. I'd like to give you a few reminders first. Handouts to all the sessions will be located on the League's website and on the League's conference mobile app, and that biographical information on all our conference speakers are included in that conference app as well. Let me remind you right now to please turn off your cell phones or turn them to vibrate. Short-term rentals, that's what we're here to learn about, have become incredibly popular with travelers and financially rewarding for property owners. The scale and growth of the industry has been remarkable, with many sites allowing property owners to rent to strangers on a nightly or a weekly basis. But while this phenomena has been a boon for some, it has also had significant negative impacts for many communities. Our speaker today will review the experiences of various communities that have taken different approaches to short-term rentals to reduce their negative side effects and to explore how local governments can achieve their community's goals and receive financial benefits by adopting and enforcing reasonable short-term rental regulations. All of you who were at the resolution committee know that Fountain Hills brought this forward. Fountain Hills, sometimes, even though we're a very small town, we're kind of a microcosm of what's going on in the rest of Arizona, and as we did more research, we found out that so many other municipalities were having the same problem that we were having. So we knew that we really needed to take another look at this at the legislative level. To be fair with the legislature, as sometimes I try to be to John, I think that when they passed this, they had good intentions, thinking of a nice family renting a home together and just having a nice quiet weekend. Nobody anticipated the parties, you know, the loud meetups and all this stuff that I'm learning about, that my son knows about but I don't, that, you know, you just drop in and you have this big party with a bunch of strangers you don't even know. You make a lot of noise and you disrupt the whole neighborhood. So many of us are being faced with that. Our speaker today is going to help us so that when we do formulate this legislation, we really have some good sound basis for doing that. So I'd like to introduce Mr. Ulrich Binzer. He's the CEO and founder of Host Compliance. And I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Binzer right now. And thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. As Mayor Cavanaugh said, my name is Ulrich Binzer, and I am with a company called Host Compliance that works with cities and counties across the entire nation to solve these issues. So what I'm going to do today is just give you a quick introduction to us so you know who we are and what we do. Then for the people who may not be super familiar with short-term rentals, just give you a quick 101 lesson on that. Then I will share with you a lot of data that we've collected on the Arizona market. And I think that you're going to find that this data is very interesting because it really gives you a much better sense of the scale and scope of the industry. I also have data broken out by community. So if you happen to be in one of the communities that had a lot of these, there's a good chance that the numbers will be up there. So you can actually go home and tell your constituents and colleagues what's happening, especially in your city. And if it's not on the screen, I'm happy to provide you backup analysis afterwards if that would be of help. After sort of understanding the data, I want to take a few minutes to talk a little bit about why this is important. And I do know that a lot of you that are here probably already know that it's important, but there are a lot of different aspects to this issue, and I think it's important that you understand the perspectives of all the various stakeholders and all the issues, so you as elected and administrators can help your communities come to the right solution as to how to deal with this issue, hopefully, if the state gives you a little bit more leeway. After that, I'll give you a little bit of best practices for how cities outside of Arizona have implemented rules that actually makes this work for everyone. Because I think the good news is that you don't have to essentially deal with all these problems. There are now regulatory tools that allow cities to combat all the negative side effects, and there are also enforcement tools and processes that makes it cost effective to actually enforce these types of regulations. And then finally, I'm going to open for Q&A and happy to take any questions that you have. So that's what I had in mind for this session. To start with a quick introduction, I founded this company, Host Compliance, back in 2015 because the city that I live in Northern California was faced with all the same issues that many of your communities are faced with right now. As a result, our town council decided that they wanted to do something about it. And they did a couple of public hearings, and I participated in that. And one of the things they found quickly was that no one had any idea what was going on. There was a lot of conjecture, there was a lot of anecdotal evidence, but no one had any numbers. No one had any correlations. No one actually really understood what was going on. And I thought that was a pity because I really believe that public policy should be based on facts and data. So the first thing I did was I figured out how to just run the numbers for any given community. Then I started talking to a lot of cities around the country who were facing the same data issues and quickly learned that this was not just in my little town, it was basically everywhere that there was this issue. And out of that came Host Compliance. So Host Compliance today is the world's leading provider of short-term rental compliance solutions. The team behind it really consists of two types of people. There are big data nerds like myself. I'm a Harvard guy, I love data. My co-founder is a Caltech applied math wizard, and we just love to use software and data tools to solve problems. And then the other part of our company are people who work with local governments for the last 20 years and really understand how local governments work. And between those, we've been able to create some pretty good solutions for our folks. So what we do is we provide custom data on the short-term rental industry. We provide consulting services to help cities implement rules that work for their community. And then finally, we help them implement enforcement mechanisms to make sure that the rules are actually being followed. Right now, we work with more than 135 cities across the country. We work with really big places like Los Angeles, San Diego, Seattle, Denver, Las Vegas. But we also work with really small communities. And here in Arizona, we actually work with Fountain Hills. We worked with them for a couple of years. We were with Paradise Valley down the street from here as well. And we work with the city of Prescott. So we have quite a lot of experience also in Arizona. And as you know, Fountain Hills is not necessarily a huge city. I think there's about 20,000 people there. And the good thing about our solution is it works for big companies, big cities and small cities. So that's a little bit about us here. So let's talk about short-term rentals and what that really is. And I think before we sort of get too deep into the data, I think it's important to define the different terms that we're going to be using. First of all, short-term rentals, there isn't sort of like a Webster's dictionary definition, but the way that most cities and towns define it is that they say it's the rental of residential dwelling units for less than a month. So typically 30 or 31 day duration. And it can literally be any residential dwelling unit. Most people obviously rent out houses and apartments, but people also rent out RVs, houseboats, tree houses, teepees, like you name it. So it's a very broad category. As you probably also know that this market has really changed in recent years. There's obviously always been vacation rentals. They used to be managed by local property management firms and realtors, but in the last decade, all of this market has essentially moved online. So instead of having local companies involved in the facilitation of rentals, it's now large technology companies that does it. The biggest ones are Airbnb, which is a San Francisco-based company. It's a company called VRBO that's owned by Expedia Group. There's a company called Flipkey that's owned by TripAdvisor. Booking.com does it. Basically, all of the major travel companies are now involved with that. And there's actually more than 125 different websites that facilitates this kind of business. And what these companies do is that they essentially make it easy for people who want to rent a property to find a property, book it, and pay it. And it all happens online. Can happen even on a cell phone. You could be right here in this meeting and you could book a property right this moment. Because of that, there's basically no barrier to entry. Anyone can essentially participate in this market as long as you have access to the internet and can take a few photos. You can essentially put your home up for rent. As a result, there's been a tremendous growth. So what this chart shows is the number of listings, which are essentially online ads for short-term rentals on a global scale from 2011 through 2017. And what you can see here is that there's now 8 million online listings out there, which is up from about 900,000 about 8 years ago. So just in this relatively short amount of time, there's been an 800% growth in this industry. And obviously, you don't see a lot of industries growing at that speed. And what's really driving it is that consumer behavior is really changing. So, for example, if you track where people search for hotel and travel accommodation, more people now go to Airbnb than go to any of the hotel websites, even like hotels.com, which is a really big shift, right? I mean, like 5 years ago, no one of you had ever heard about Airbnb, and now suddenly it's the most popular travel website in the world. When you ask people, both business travelers and normal tourists, whether or not they use Airbnb, about 25% of the US population who travels has now stayed at a short-term vacation rental. And that's up from about 12% just 4 years ago. So there's a fundamental shift changing in essentially consumer behavior, and that obviously reflects itself in the numbers. So if you look at the valuation of a company like Airbnb, they're currently valued at $31 billion, so it's billion with a B. By the way, that's more than Hilton, Marriott, Wyndham, and some of the major hotel companies out there. And one of the things that's a little bit interesting is that these guys don't actually own a single property, right? Normally, a hotel company has to spend millions or billions of dollars of building hotel properties, keeping them staffed and so on. And this company, Airbnb, they literally just have a website. So it's an incredible amount of value creation. And as a result, there's a lot of people who want to play in this market. So as I mentioned briefly before, there are now 125 different sort of websites out there that try to cater to a certain segment in this. To give you some examples of the kind of websites that are out there right now, there's a company called Couchsurfing. They literally cater to folks who just want to rent a place to sleep on a couch for the night. There are an Airbnb for nudists, believe it or not. There is an Airbnb for people traveling with kids. There's an Airbnb for people traveling with pets. There are all these different niche markets. And as the market grows, it fragments quite a lot. So one of the things that's important to understand is that it's not just about Airbnb. I'll show you some market share statistics in a few minutes, but it's important to really understand that this is an industry phenomena, and you need to think about it holistically. So what does this mean? One of the things that's coming out of this is that short-term vacation rentals is becoming a real issue across the nation. So right now, if you do an analysis and say, how many cities and towns and unincorporated counties out there have more than 50 short-term rentals, that is about 3,500 now. Just for reference, there's about 30,000 cities and counties in the country. So it's more than 10% that are now being affected by this new phenomena. And I'll give you some data on what's happening in Arizona a little bit later. So what's happening in Arizona? I ran some numbers, and the numbers that I have here are from March. I didn't have time to run them this month, but I think you won't see a big difference just given the seasonality of the Arizona market. And summer is actually not the high season, believe it or not. Right now, if you look out there, there are about 30,000 short-term rental listings posted online for properties located in Arizona. That said, one of the things that's important to understand is that there is a fair amount of duplication. So people will take their property and they will actually post it on multiple websites. So it's not uncommon that you see someone having an ad on, for example, Airbnb, and then they have an ad for the same exact property on Flipkey, and then maybe a third ad on something like TripAdvisor.com. So what we don't want to do is sort of like double count, because then suddenly people may get a sense that there are more than there really are. So when you remove the duplicate, you end up with about 23,000 unique rental units in the state right now, which is obviously quite a lot. If you look at how that has grown, back in June of 2016, we ran an analysis, and at that time there was about 19,000 listings, and now there is about 30,000. So it's a 56% growth in just less than 2 years. So it's not like an industry that seems to be going away. It's on the contrary, growing very rapidly. If you look at the number of cities, towns, and unincorporated county jurisdictions in Arizona that now have more than 100 short-term rentals, that number has gone up from about 32 back in June of 2016 to 44 now. So there's a lot of places where this is actually starting to become an issue, and the list is constantly growing as the industry is growing, and properties are spreading sort of from city centers and tourist destinations to like the suburban areas surrounding those, and even out to the rural areas. And as a result, there will be more and more friction in these communities. To give you a sense about where these properties are located, and this might be a little bit hard to read, so I'm going to give you a little bit of time to sort of like digest it. I listed these in order of size, so descending order. So I could have done it, I guess, alphabetically, but I thought it was interesting to just show sort of the concentration. And one of the things I think that's really important, especially when you think about the resolution that you guys just passed on Tuesday about working with the state legislature to give you the power back to regulate this, is that there really isn't a one-size-fits-all policy that's going to solve these problems. And the reason I say that is because 90% of Arizona short-term rentals are located in only 29 jurisdictions. There are literally like hundreds of other jurisdictions out there that are pretty much unaffected, and somehow like believing that the same solution is going to be working in those rural areas as it's going to work in a place like Phoenix and Scottsdale or Tucson just doesn't make a lot of sense. This is really a local issue, and I'm really happy to see that you guys passed this resolution. I think that's going to be a good step forward, and hopefully the state will respond positively. So what you're seeing here is that there are essentially a number of communities, call it like almost like a handful or two, where there are thousands of them. Obviously, Phoenix tops the list with about 4,200 unique rental units. Scottsdale has about 3,300. Pima County, and this is only unincorporated Pima County, I don't want to double count, it's about 1,300 and so forth. But you can also see that even as you work down the list and get to number 28, a place like Mohave County, there is still about 150 rental units, which is quite a lot in a community of that size. So these are the numbers, and again, I'm happy to share those with you. And also, if your city or town is not on the list, come up to me afterwards. I'm happy to take your card, and I can send you an analysis of your particular jurisdiction. To speak a little bit about the market, as I mentioned, the market is fragmenting. I didn't want to list every site here because it gets a little bit complicated. But I think the big takeaway is that Airbnb is about 57% of the market. So although people talk about staying at an Airbnb and they use that as essentially a shorthand for a vacation rental, it's really only about a little bit more than half of them that are Airbnbs. Expedia, as I mentioned, controls a lot of different vacation rental websites. So they have VRBO, they have HomeAway, they have vacationrentals.com, they have something called Stays. They have about, I think, 21 different sites now. I consolidated them all under the Expedia group just to make it simpler. TripAdvisor has about 7 or 8 different sites. The biggest one is a site called Flipkey. Booking.com, which is a giant travel conglomerate, is getting into this business and have about 4% market share. And then Tripping is an aggregator. They actually support something like 30 different websites. So all in all, this represents 50 different unique websites, but grouped together by corporate parent. So that just gives you a little bit of sense of the market here. In terms of the properties that are being rented, 86% of Arizona short-term rentals are entire home rentals. And To understand that, I think it's important to understand what the opposite is, and that is what we call partial home rentals, especially room rentals. And this is one of the things that's a little bit different from the traditional understanding of vacation rental. Like, people used to think of vacation rentals as like you get essentially the entire home for your use during the entire stay. And that is definitely the case in 86% of the cases, but there's also 14% of the cases where people just rent out a spare bedroom or a couch or other partial part of the home. The fact that 86% of them are entire home rentals is important because those are the ones that generally create the most havoc. Because they're essentially unsupervised rentals, right? The host or the owner is not necessarily on site, and therefore the guests have the ability and freedom to kind of do whatever they want, which in most of the cases isn't a problem, but it can become an issue in situations like your sons and others. They also tend to be the ones that have the biggest implications on housing affordability. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but one of the big trends is that investors have figured out that they can buy up what used to be traditional long-term rental units, evict the tenants, and turn these properties into short-term rentals. Obviously, the entire home rentals are the ones that are most likely to be converted because those are the ones where there's the most money and also the easiest to manage if you're an investor with a big portfolio. So the entire home rentals are really important to understand, and I think that's maybe where the state legislature got a little bit wrong when they passed the original rules, that they kind of assumed that it was all this home sharing, but what they didn't realize was that most of it is essentially these entire home rentals, which are the ones that have the biggest potential to be disturbing to the neighbors. In terms of the types of properties that are being rented out, 62% of the homes in Arizona that are listed online right now are single-family homes. Again, those are the ones that tend to have a lot of friction with the neighbors because people move into residential single-family home communities because they want the peace and quiet, and they don't expect to have people too close by. 30% are in multifamily homes, and then there's 8% that we can't see from the listings. It's not completely clear. It could be duplexes and other things like that. So what's the big deal here? There's a lot of data. Do you guys need a break? Good. So I think the first thing to acknowledge is that there are really two sides to this issue, right? There is a very valid economic development story. To sort of make it simple, right? When people are renting out a vacation rental, money obviously accrues to the owner of that property. There's also additional spending in the surrounding communities, so people go out to eat, people spend money at the local stores, people spend money on entertainment and amusement parks and so forth. There's also a tax component. I call it TOT here, but it's essentially a lodging tax. There's potentially sales tax, and all in all, this can actually add up. So this is an analysis that was made in the city of San Diego, and it basically showed that each of these vacation rentals generated about $35,000 of economic benefit to the broader community. These are obviously not necessarily representative of what's going on here in Arizona. Like, San Diego is a very famous vacation destination. But there's definitely areas like Sedona and Scottsdale where these numbers could be representative. But I think the big point to know is that there's definitely economic benefit, and we shouldn't discount that. On the other hand, there is also potential negative side effects. They really run the gamut. We talked a little bit about housing affordability, and this is really this issue that investors buy up properties, convert them into short-term rentals, get rid of the long-term tenants, and then suddenly you have less availability of affordable long-term rental housing in the community. That can be a huge problem in places like Sedona, because at the end of the day, no one who works there can afford to live there anymore, right? There's also other places like that in the state. And it's not something that should be discounted. And right now, the way the state rules are, there's really nothing that the cities can do to deal with this. The other thing that's obviously really important to think about is how this impacts the neighborhood character and the fabric of the community. So suddenly, if you look at Sedona, and I don't know if any of you have been there recently, when you walk around downtown Sedona, it's all tourists, right? I mean, it's not really a residential community anymore. So if you moved into a place like that, hoping that you could be part of the community and it was sort of, you just want to make it a home, that's not necessarily what you're going to get anymore. And obviously that has implications. Then there are the problems with visitors not always knowing the local rules or acting and following them. So it's not uncommon that you have problems with parking and trash. Parking is obvious because what happens is when people rent a vacation rental is that they tend to bring big groups, right? You basically, if you ever go on a vacation rental, you tend to bring like the cousins and the grandparents, and suddenly you're like 5 cars outside a residential building, and there's maybe only 2 parking spots on site, so now there are 3 cars in the street, and if there isn't any parking available, then that can be a big problem. The trash is similar, but a little bit more complex. So what happens is that most of the rentals occur over weekends or long weekends. So what happens is people essentially take out the trash when they leave the house and call it Sunday night. And let's say trash pickup day is Friday. Now you have trash sitting in the street for 4 or 5 days. And that can either turn into a raccoon fest, or it can be really smelly and be problematic for the neighbors as well. So these are very real and valid concerns. Then there's the issue with the party houses. You mentioned one. There's a very famous one in Paradise Valley, which is one of our clients. This is a Frank Lloyd Wright building that has been used for corporate events and weddings for a while, and it's basically being rented out on Airbnb for something like $10,000, $13,000 a night. People come, and there's literally a wedding or something going on every Saturday. And if you live right next to that building, it can be very, very frustrating, because while you obviously appreciate that these people are having a good time and celebrating their wedding, and you don't like necessarily feel bad about these folks, it's just the sort of like scale of it and the repeated nature of it that can be frustrating. There are also the issues of sort of like parties getting completely out of hand. Like literally people will rent these Airbnbs and as Mayor Kavanagh mentioned, essentially bring in 200 people and have a really good time at the pool at the expense of the neighbors. Trash we talked a little bit about, and then there's also a thing that may not be super sort of like important to you, but it still matters, and that is there is definitely a cannibalization of the hotels, right? So the hotels used to obviously employ people who were paid minimum wage. They had to adhere to certain ADA standards, and there were lots of sort of rules they had to follow. And suddenly all these vacation rentals pump up, and they don't necessarily pay people minimum wage. They don't necessarily follow all these rules. And that can be perceived as being unfair and can create conflict with the traditional lodging industry. In terms of what this means in sort of the communities, like obviously the people who live close to these properties get very frustrated. Here are some quotes for some actual folks living in Austin, Texas, which is not that dissimilar from Arizona. Large properties, residential neighborhoods, pools, and these were some quotes that I got out of a news article recently. But you can see that like these are really real implications, and they affect everyone in the community. So if you survey your constituents, I'm sure you're going to hear similar stories. Then there's the problem about whether or not people actually play by the rules. So one of the things that typically occurs is that the people who operate these short-term vacation rentals, they're not necessarily super sophisticated operators. They don't understand that there might be rules they have to comply with. So in cities where there is a registration requirement, which is obviously not the case in Arizona right now, but at least they need to register with the state and pay taxes there, and a lot of people just don't do that. So as a result, there really isn't a lot of benefit to the sort of like overall community. It kind of all accrues to the owners of the property. As a result of this, short-term rentals really has become one of the hottest issues in many Arizona communities. If you sort of like go around and talk to your colleagues here, I have a feeling that most of you probably have at least one story or two about these things that are coming up to city council or town council level and creating friction. Here are some recent news stories that I pulled, and you can see it really runs the gamut from the Attorney General coming down on the city of Sedona for requiring a business license to essentially stories about Airbnb property owners making a killing. And as you can see, it's just really a lot of different nuances and stories in this. So what do you do about it? And as we talked about, right now you really are tied on your hands. This is an excerpt from the current Arizona state law. This is State Bill 1350, where it basically says that a city cannot prohibit vacation rentals and really can't regulate it solely on the basis of the use or occupancy. There are some ways around it. We'll talk a little bit about that. But so like from a highest level perspective, this is a hard issue to come around. And that's why I think it's important that you guys pass the resolution you passed on Tuesday, and hopefully people will listen at the next state legislative session. The good news is that banning short-term rentals really doesn't work that well anyway. A lot of cities have tried it. And here are some examples of cities of Santa Barbara and Redondo Beach, California, that literally tried to ban short-term rentals. And if you go online right now and search, for example, Santa Barbara, you'll see around 1,500 short-term rentals advertised despite this ban. So it's not like they took away like a tool that necessarily would be too effective, like just like banning is not necessarily the solution. It also happens to be that sort of like the opposite doesn't quite work. So like the complete laissez-faire where you are now tends to not work. So what you end up typically seeing when that is the case is that there is a sort of like massive Wild West behavior popping up, which you're probably seeing right now. And then typically there is like some pretty big backlash. So I wouldn't be surprised that in a year or two, this is going to boil over and it's going to maybe go completely the other direction unless you come up with a compromise. So here's some examples of places where they essentially banned these places and then ended up going completely the other direction and so forth. So instead what you can do is that you can put in place some broadly applicable rules to deal with safety and zoning. And that's still allowed. So here's the excerpt from State Bill 1350 that basically say that you can still regulate short-term rentals if it's for the protection of the public health and safety. And this include fire and building codes, health and sanitation, transportation, traffic controls, and so forth. That you're still allowed to do, but this is very important, you're only allowed to do that if it is for the primary purpose of protecting public health and safety. So if somehow the Attorney General thinks that you're kind of coming up with technical reasons to do this, to essentially come up with rules to ban or restrict it, you might be in violation. And that's what happened to Sedona, where the state Attorney General felt that the business license requirement was essentially a way to try to get around the more broader state preemption. The other thing that you can do is that you can require an emergency point of contact. And that is actually pretty important because that allows you to at least have a way to deal with ad hoc quality of life issues in real time. So if you know who's operating these properties and you have someone you can contact, at least when the party house does happen, you have a way to deal with it. So you still have a few things you can do. You can also adopt broader rules. So if you, for example, believe that safety inspections are required, you can do that, but you need to essentially apply that across your entire residential housing stock. So it might not be practical, but at least you can still do it if it really is important to you and you think there are some imminent safety issues. So that's essentially what it says right now. Again, you're pretty tied. That doesn't mean that you can't do anything, but you can't do what they do everywhere else, which is essentially come up with sensible rules, which is unfortunate. Sort of thinking a little bit about what to do about it, I talked to some other folks across the country over in Florida last week where I was speaking at a similar conference, and one of the things that they were doing there, which I thought was pretty creative, was that they were coming up with ways to work with the local HOAs and condo associations to essentially get them to pass rules, and then they would come up with collaborations where they would say, we, the city or town, will help the HOA enforce those rules. And that's legal as long as the HOA or condo association reimburses the city for the expense associated with that. And by essentially encouraging or working with all these HOAs to come up with rules that are uniform, you can actually end up with a solution to the problem anyway, even though that the state doesn't allow you as a city to pass these rules. So it's something that you might want to consider here as well. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm going to let your lawyers kind of like think about this a little bit. But what I'm trying to say is that by being creative and working with other stakeholders, there might be a way to get over some of these limitations. In terms of what else you can do, there are some things you may consider, and again, you should consult with your local council as to whether or not these work for you. But one of the concerns that's been raised in a lot of communities is that just the physical appearance of these neighborhoods is changing. So people starting to put up like signs, like world's best Airbnb or whatever in the front yard. Like I've heard stories, and I've actually seen photos of this from Anaheim in California, where people have close to Disneyland literally turned houses into like Mickey Mouse houses. Like it's unbelievable, right? So they'll put like putting greens in the shape of Mickey Mouse. They'll like paint them pink. They'll do all sorts of weird stuff to appeal to tourists essentially. And the local city council there have come up with ways to essentially prevent that kind of behavior. In terms of what you can do to deal with quality of life, we talked a little bit about registration requirements. It can't be a business license, so it's not like you can say no to it, but at least you can ask for an emergency contact person. So if there is an issue, you can reach out to them. And I do think that is a good idea because at least you can then deal with the most egregious violations. In terms of parking, sanitation, garbage disposal, and all that stuff, I mean, you can also deal with that still. You just need to make sure that these rules are essentially applicable to any residential property. So, for example, if you do say that there has to be certain sanitation needs that are met, like then they also have to apply to all the other homes in the area. Same with garbage and so forth. Noise ordinances are a little bit tougher, right? So one of the solutions that have been used in a lot of other communities, not Arizona, is that cities will require short-term rental hosts to essentially post a summary of the noise ordinance on the inside of every exterior door to just remind the guests that they're not supposed to make noise after 10 p.m. or whatever. It's a little bit harder to do here, but I mean, if it really is an issue, you might like tell everyone that they need to do that, and you can maybe get around it that way. We talked about emergency contacts. Event permits is another way that you can maybe deal with party houses and stuff like that. Again, it has to be universal, but like some cities have essentially put in place rules that says if you have more than 20 people gathering, you need to get an event permit. Again, it might seem like overreach because if someone wants to host their daughter's wedding or something like that, it feels like they should be allowed to without asking permission. On the other hand, it might be a way to like deal with these houses like the one in Paradise Valley where you literally have parties every weekend. Then you can do something about occupancy limits. Again, you might set broad rules that say we don't allow 20 people to stay in a 2-bedroom apartment. Again, it has to apply to everyone, but it might be something you want to do. And then finally, some cities are doing physical safety inspections and habitability inspections. Again, it has to apply broadly. So that's a little bit about what cities are doing out there. I think the point, though, is that it doesn't have to be rocket science to kind of come up with a solution to these problems, especially if the state gives you a little bit more leeway. And I think the first thing you need to do, if and when that's possible, is to really start with the data. Like figure out how many are there in your community, how often they're being used, what's the kind of properties that are being used, and then craft regulations that actually address the real issues as opposed to all the perceived issues. It's also really important to understand that there are all these different stakeholders in this matter, so you need to compromise. Not everyone is going to get everything they want with this, and to get the most sustainable solution, you need to acknowledge that there's a little bit of give and take here. And then finally, the cities that have implemented these rules most successfully think of it as a continuous process. So they essentially revise their ordinance every couple of years, because otherwise you might end up with rules that are essentially outdated. So that was a little bit about regulations and what cities are doing. To just talk a little bit about the enforcement side of things, to start with a little bit of context. Compliance has really been the problem for most cities that have been trying to regulate this in the past. Here are some data points from some of the cities that we have worked with before we started working with them. And like a place like Hallandale Beach in Florida, they had literally 1% compliance in terms of permit registration before we got in there. Virginia Beach, big vacation destination in Virginia, had about 5%. But there's hope. So after about 6 months, we started working in Denver, we had compliance of about 65% there. So by using tools and being smart about how to get people in compliance, you can actually make a pretty big dent. The big barrier to compliance has always been that you have so many properties, and traditional sort of local government code enforcement techniques are not super helpful at scale. A lot of code enforcement folks that I talk to describe the short-term rental issue as like bringing a knife to a gunfight. You're just not going to win if you're a sole code enforcement guy sitting in an office and you're trying to compete with 2,000 engineers in San Francisco. It's just not possible. So you need to essentially come up with some other techniques to deal with this. But so like the manual barriers to compliance is that you have all these different websites, so you have to really monitor them all. Then you have all these duplicates, right? So you have to figure out which ones you already figured out what was going on, so you don't essentially duplicate your efforts. There's a massive amount of churn in the market. So typically in a given city, more than 60% of the rentals turn over in a given year. So if you really did an analysis at the beginning of the year, say there were 100 properties, by the end of the year, only 40 of those original 100 are still operating. But typically, you'll have 70 new that came online. So net, your industry grew, but it's all new guys. So that means that new people you need to reach out to, new people you need to get into compliance. Also, the address information is not available in these online ads. So it's not like you can just go on them and note down the address. What they do instead is that they put a dot on a map and say the property is located somewhere inside of that dot. But they don't actually put it in the center of the dot. They actually deliberately move the dot in a random direction about 800 feet, or sometimes 800 yards actually, which just makes it very, very time consuming to find them. Obviously, if you don't know where they are, it's very hard to get them into compliance with tax requirements and so forth. And as you probably know, the vacation rental platforms have not been very forthcoming with information. They basically refuse to share anything with local governments. As a result, some cities have said, we'll just sit back and we'll wait for the complaints to come in. We're not even going to try to be proactive about this. And unfortunately, that doesn't really work so well because the only thing you will hear about as a city is when things have gone completely haywire, like when you have that party house or something like that. You're not going to hear about all the silent conversion of short-term rentals into long-term housing into short-term rentals. You're not going to hear about the quality of life issues until they really get really bad. So what to do about it? So I think the first thing is if and when you have the ability is to write an ordinance that's enforceable. And one of the things that they say is that you need to make it very explicit what constitutes noncompliance. So a lot of cities that have done this successfully have actually written into the ordinance that if you are advertising anywhere and you're not properly registered, that is considered a violation of the ordinance in and of itself. And here's some examples of language from a couple of cities that have that. And that's really important because otherwise, if you have to literally prove that someone essentially dragged the suitcase through the front door, you're never going to be able to do that because your code enforcement folks will never be able to be like sitting in a tree with a camera ready to essentially catch them when they do that. So having very good language in the ordinance is important. The other thing that's really important is that you make sure that operators are required to keep records of their business activity. And also require that each unit is actually registered under a unique registration number. Some cities have said, you know what, we'll let property managers register 25 properties under one registration number. But if that's the case, the city doesn't really know what's going on with each individual property, and it can become very, very complex to enforce. If you do a registration process, it's also really important that you make it relatively easy to comply. Here's literally an example from San Francisco's permit process a year and a half ago. And if you count, I think there's 31 boxes on this chart. I mean, no one can figure that out, obviously, right? I mean, it's just like a full-time job. You need to hire a lawyer to even figure out how to apply for this. And that's not how it should be. So really keep it simple. Is really, really helpful. That also include making it possible to apply online. And obviously, we're living in 2018, so it shouldn't come as a surprise. But believe it or not, like if you go to a lot of city websites, there really aren't any online application forms for a lot of things. I was just looking at City of Surprise, Arizona here, and you had to literally download a document, fill it in by hand, mail it in. And then the worst thing of that is that someone in the receiving end now has to take all that information and type it into some kind of database. So everyone just wasted a bunch of time. So really using technology to make it easy is really helpful. We talked a little bit about this turnover point, right? So here's an example. This is South Lake Tahoe, California, which is one of our clients. And if you look at that situation, we ran analysis, and this was literally over less than a year, right? So, for example, if you looked at the market back in October 2016, there was about 3,000 online listings. Over the next 11 months, a new sort of group of people came online. About 1,800 new listings came online. So over the total year, there was essentially 4,800 properties that the city would have had to keep track of. In the meantime, about 1,500 of the original guys stopped operating. So now, like, you want to make sure that you don't continue to send them letters and like deal with them, because that's just a waste of time. And if you do the whole analysis, you end up at the end of the year with 54% of the operators at the end of the year being new into the market. So just illustrates this like very dynamic and sort of like difficult to enforce marketplace. The other thing that's really important is that you have a way to systematically capture evidence of activity, right? Because one of the things that always happens is if you try to bring someone to justice is they're going to basically challenge you. So they're going to say, what are you talking about? I'm not doing anything. So you send them a letter, they take down their online listing, and then essentially all your evidence goes away. So that doesn't really help you. So one of the things that we do is we actually take screenshots of every single listing every week, save it in a database with a timestamp on it. So if the city ever needs it, they can pull it up and they can hold people accountable. Very important point. The other thing that's important is because of this really quick turnover in the marketplace, there are people who literally like come and go within a month. So if it takes you 2 months to sort of like get your act together to send a letter to tell them that they are not in compliance, they might be gone before you even get to them. So you need to have an automatic way to notify people that they are not in compliance. And one of the things we have found that makes the response rate on these letters go up dramatically is that we can put a screenshot of the online ad in the letter here. And when you do that, it's kind of like the red light camera. Like, I don't know if any of you have had the privilege of getting a ticket from a red light camera. I have. But like when you see like that picture of you sort of like going right through the red light, you're not going to like dispute that ticket, right? It's just too stupid. And this works exactly the same way. So if you do that, you end up with about 60% becoming compliant in the first letter, another 60% of the remaining coming compliant in the second letter. So you essentially get something like 90% compliance on 2 letters, which is really helpful. You also want to make it very easy for neighbors that are experiencing issues with these rentals to not only report them to the city, but also provide evidence to the city so they actually have a case, right? Because otherwise you can easily end up in a situation that's like a he said, she said situation. And then at the end of the day, after the fact, no one really knew what happened. And it's very hard to actually hold people accountable. So one of the things that we've done is that we built a service where people can essentially call us and report the issue 24/7. We'll then ask if they would be willing to share any photos, videos, screenshots, audio recordings, whatever it may be that they have that they think can help the city substantiate the complaint. And then we'll send them a text message or an email, and then what they can do is that they can essentially just click on that link, upload all the stuff that they have from their phone directly or if they have it on a computer, and it goes straight into the case file that the city has. And now the city actually has a fair chance at doing something about it, which is what the neighbor wants. And the other thing that we can do is that we can actually call the emergency contact person, and remember we talked about that before, really important to have that in real time. So again, if someone calls us, we will look up in our database right there and then if this is a property that is registered with the city. If it is, we will look up the phone number of the emergency contact and we will place an outbound phone call to that person right there. And then we'll basically notify them that we received a complaint and ask them to deal with it. This is really helpful to the neighbor because at the end of the day, the neighbor just want this issue to go away, right? They don't want to wait for Monday morning where code enforcement gets back into the office. That doesn't actually save their night. So having an ability to be proactive and reach out to folks is really important. And then finally, if, for example, after 30 minutes, the issue is still unresolved, we will place an outbound call to the original complainant and ask, was this essentially resolved to your satisfaction? If it was, we say, thank you, it's great. If not, we can escalate it to the local police or sheriff or code enforcement department or whatever it is. So it is a way to really give a very practical, very effective solution to a problem that's otherwise hard to solve. Finally, we talked a little bit about modern technology. We have solutions for all of these things. I'm not going to talk too much about it, but I think the point is, if and when you do decide to do something about it, don't assume that you need to hire an entire army of code enforcement folks. That's not necessarily going to be the cost-effective way to solve the problem. There are better ways to do that right now. So that's what I had in terms of prepared remarks. I think we have some time for questions here, and we can take as many or as few as we get.
Mm-hmm. Alex? Okay.
All right, well, thank you for the interesting presentation. It's, I guess, a little bit kind of sense of justice that technology is being used to at least lessen the damage that technology caused. But to say that the legislature kind of drank the Kool-Aid on this 2 years ago is an understatement. As you said, this was sold as the elderly couple whose kids have moved out of the nest, have an empty room, and they want to make a little extra cash, and there's this exchange student from Sweden who's here. You know, I mean, nobody ever thought of people forming corporations to purchase single-family homes in residential areas purely to turn them into commercial enterprises. And that's my first question. Yeah, you can argue that a rental of a room or even a house, if the person, you know, is a part-time resident, is still using it for residential purposes. But have any jurisdictions been successful in basically saying, this is totally commercial, you violated our zoning ordinances, and you got to shut down immediately?
Absolutely, that's a great question, right? So, as you mentioned, few cities that have the ability to regulate it have a lot of sympathy for these out-of-town investors coming in and essentially turning residential neighborhoods into full-time hotels. So what the cities have done is that they have essentially put restrictions on who is allowed to operate a short-term rental. And the typical restriction is that if you are the primary residence, meaning this is where you're homesteaded, this is the place you call home, like your kids go to school there, like you live there the majority of the year, it can be defined as 6, 9, 12 months, whatever you think is appropriate. You are allowed to get a permit, and then if you otherwise operate within the rules, you can do this without any restrictions. But the idea is that it's only people who are essentially living there that are allowed to do it. And that, per definition, shuts down all the investors, because the investors will own 10, 20, 30 properties, and they can only live in one of them. And by the way, they do it to generate money. They don't actually want to rent out their house. They just want to essentially maximize their return on investment. So that's a great way to deal with that. And obviously, the current state law absolutely precludes that in Arizona, but that's what they're doing pretty much any other state across the country, so primary residency requirements. There are also some cities that say we will differentiate between what we call essentially hosted and unhosted stays. So if you are just renting out a room and you are actually physically present on the property during the duration of the stay, then you can do this, but if you are not physically there, you're not allowed to. And cities come to different conclusions on that. Like, so some places say it's primary residence or it's a hosted stay, others say it's both. And cities have the flexibility to do that in most states, so they can decide what works for them.
Okay. Now paying becomes an issue, and it might be a little difficult in Arizona if we passed an ordinance where everybody would have to pay like $50 or $100 to register so that we'd have money to pay for enforcement. Has anybody developed a scheme where violators would be fined and the fines could be used to pay for the enforcement, like
Absolutely.
a loser pays type thing?
Yeah. So I think I don't know exactly how things work in Arizona, but my expectation would be that, for example, if you apply for a building permit, you would have to pay for that because there's obviously some administrative costs associated with that. So what most cities and states, cities and counties do is that they actually do require people to pay for the permit, but the permit fee is directly correlated with the cost of operating the entire system, right, including the enforcement on the back end. So on average, the sort of annual permit fee in most cities is around $200, $250. And to be honest, it's not really ever been a problem because on average, these properties rent for like $250 anyway. So the idea is like, it's like essentially 1 day of operation and you made back the permit fee. And most people think that's totally fine. So basically, the typical approach is to say, let the beneficiary of the permit pay for the permit. And then on top of that, they then have fines for people who violate the ordinance. And there are different approaches to that. So some cities already have an administrative citation fee schedule. And it typically is something like $250 to maybe $1,000 per infraction. And then they count every night of illegal activity as an infraction. So it can actually add up quite a lot. We have a client like City of Napa in California. They fined someone $72,000 because they've been operating for 4 years within, like outside of compliance. So like that's what they do there. Other places have been very creative. So like City of West Hollywood, California, they actually say, we don't want to overly penalize the little operator who's just renting out a room, but we also don't want to essentially not have a deterrent for the guy who's renting out that mansion for $16,000 a night. So what they do is they say, the first infraction is 3 times your nightly rental rate. And then the second infraction is 5 times, and then I can't remember, it goes up to something, right? But the point is that you want to make it really bite, and you don't want to overly penalize folks. But the idea is that essentially the permit fee pays for the program, and then the fines and citations are essentially gravy on top of that to deal with this additional work because there's obviously legal costs associated with all that stuff.
Okay, and I guess the final question is, it seems, I mean, these platforms are big players. You know, $31 billion is the worth of one of them. Are they now? They didn't give us too much kickback last year when we did a bill which would require all of the platforms to collect the taxes, but that was mainly because the major player Airbnb was already doing that voluntarily. So I suspect that A, it didn't hurt them, and B, it might actually have helped them by leveling their field. But when the regulations attempt to control some of this really egregious stuff or to try to control people from buying houses purely for the purpose of venues, have they kicked back? Have they come back in other areas with their power and their money?
Oh, yeah, a lot. I mean, so the typical playbook of these websites is to do what they essentially did in Arizona, right? So first, they essentially say, we'll start collecting taxes, and then you essentially get the state or the city hooked on the revenue. So just to give you an example, in Los Angeles, doing short-term rentals has technically been illegal for years. But then they made a deal with the mayor of Los Angeles back in 2016 that says that they would start collecting taxes for all this illegal activity. And the mayor had a hole in his budget. He was like, sure, I'll take $15 million. That's fine. Anyway, now that's $35 million. And now the city council is up in arms because they have like 31,000 illegal short-term rentals, and housing affordability is a huge issue. So what ends up happening is that now the city is like in a bind, right? Because now they have to potentially give up $30 million if they start forcing these rules and putting more restrictions on the platforms. So it's very typical for the platforms to essentially first go in and then sort of like give people the money so they get hooked on it. And then if the cities or the states try to put restrictions on it, they will say, oh, if you want to put restrictions on it, we're not going to collect the money anymore. It's like it's you on your own. The good news being a state is you have a lot more leeway. You can actually just pass the law and they have to comply. As a city, it's a little bit harder because a lot of times these are incorporated out of state and all that stuff. So I think you should expect some pushback, to be quite honest. But I think the trend is that the cities and the regulators are essentially having a lot better luck getting sort of like their way now than it used to be, because there's some court precedent out of federal courts that basically say that the states and the cities can pass whatever laws they want, and the platforms have to comply. They can't sort of like hide themselves behind First Amendment issues and stuff like that.
And my final question. In the data that you collected, have you been able to differentiate between investor-owned versus primary resident-owned property and property that's being one-room rental, whole home rental, or venue versus home rental, or both?
Right. So the second part we can do, and I even shared some of that, right, today. It's easy to say if it's a room rental, and also if it's a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bedroom or whatever, all that stuff that we have. Knowing definitively whether or not it is a primary residence or investor owned is hard for us to know on the outside, because, to be honest, they look the same on the ads. So we can't say that. We have a lot of data, obviously, from the many clients that we serve that gives us that information. So we can tell you for other areas, but we wouldn't be able to tell you, so like before we came in here and worked with the state or whoever it was to actually give you those numbers on the ownership structure.
Okay, and I actually lied. That wasn't my final question. In Arizona, we have a lot of so-called snowbirds, and I suspect there would be a fair amount of sympathy for a snowbird who owns a home here fully, but it's not their primary residence. I think there would be sympathy to allow them to do some of this rental information. So based on the way you collect data, is there a way to determine if somebody claims this is not my primary, it's my secondary house, that it's their only secondary house?
Right.
Like in the whole U.S.?
It's a little bit hard to do it, because then you have to correlate it with data for every city across the country, right? And at the end of the day, we don't have access to that data. I wish we did, but we don't. So it's not super easy. But what most cities do, though, is if they do want to protect the ability of snowbirds to rent out, is that they essentially make 2 requirements in the ordinance. So first, they say that you're only allowed to rent out 1 property in the jurisdiction. So per definition, you root out the investors again. Right? Obviously, the investor can then own a property in 17 different cities, but at the end of the day, that's not really your problem. You can't deal with that. And so that's the first thing. And then they have people sign under affidavit, penalty of perjury, that this is true and accurate. And then if it is a property that is not deeded in their name, they actually ask them to provide the information on the owners behind the LLC or whatever it is. So there are ways to do that.
Yeah, you could probably also require them to have been cited at least once for driving too slow on a street.
That might be helpful too.
Can you hear me? Thank you. Just so I'm clear, are cities and state also still allowed, even with the state law, to collect sales tax concerning that property? Because in my definition, it's considered as a motel, and so I would assume we would collect sales tax as a motel.
Right. So after the SB 1350, the state legislature actually adopted another bill last year that require the platforms of short-term rental websites to collect taxes on behalf of their operators, and then remit that to the state. And if there is also a hotel tax in that city, collect that as well, and then remit it back to the city. So technically, all that is being done. There are some very weak audit provisions in those agreements, to be honest. Like, I don't have any idea how the poor finance guys at the state actually knows if the numbers that they get are real. But theoretically, they get the money and should pay it back to the cities.
Thank you. My name is John Martinez. I'm from the city of Sedona, which you've mentioned several times. But it seems that some of the steps you're mentioning, we got our hands slapped on it. We can't get them to register. We can't get them to get licenses. But yet you mentioned, get a license, make them pay for it, so therefore it pays for code enforcement. So we tried that, and we got a 1487 slapped on us. So yeah, my work in LA, my work in California, but it's not working here in Arizona. So now what is your answer to that?
Like, no, so I hope I was clear. I guess I wasn't. But the point was like, there's not as many things you can do here, right? It's like you can require an emergency contact. That you're still allowed to do. You can require all properties, residential properties, to meet certain occupancy standards, safety standards, health standards, and so forth. But it has to universally apply to any residential property. And then, so I mean, you can do that. Obviously, I think everyone who's here will agree that that may not fly well, right? Because at the end of the day, if you suddenly have to inspect every residential property in the city, that's just not practical, and some people may consider that government overreach. So I hope I'm clear. Like, it is not easy in Arizona. It really isn't. And I think Sedona, tried hard, and I think you did a good job. So like trying to push the envelope as much as you could. Unfortunately, it didn't quite work, and I think that's why. Working with your colleagues at the state level to get some of that power back is so important, which is why I'm happy that there are some representatives here today, and hopefully they can take the word back to the state.
So, taking the lead from my colleague over there, my first question, is this Russia or the United States we're talking about here? So, the second question is, you said you're a big data person, so I saw lots of holes of some of the data, but one of the data, do you have, I think it was like 22,000 rentals that we have in the state. How many of those have a business license right now? The reason I ask is that 3 of the 5 council members where I'm at have short-term rentals. 100% of us have business license, pay taxes, and we also talk about constituents. We are the constituents. The short-term rental people are our constituents. So to dehumanize them, as the person said yesterday in our keynote speak, I don't think is appropriate. But what percentage of that 22,000 have business license in Arizona?
I don't know that you should ask the state about that. I know that the 23,000 rentals, they will know how many people are registered. My guess would be it's not very many. At least that's how it is in Florida, for example, where there's the same requirement, only about 12% are actually compliant. And again, I don't think you should dehumanize anything. I actually used to have my own Airbnb, and the reason why I started this business was because they shut it down with what I thought was egregious regulations. What I'm trying to argue is coming up with a reasonable compromise, and I think right now maybe the pendulum swung a little bit too far on the sort of deregulation side in Arizona, and I think people are starting to recognize that. I think where everyone benefits from the sharing economy is if it essentially works for everyone, the property owners and the neighbors, and right now it may work well for you and your fellow investors and property managers, but it may not work for your neighbors, I don't know. So again, I think the key is that every city needs to come up with the right regulations that works for them, and right now they're just not allowed to do that.
And the last point, or 2 points I guess, is not a question, but I think we're conflating a lot of things together and putting it all on short-term rentals. So tourism, for one, we're a tourist state. We're always going to be a tourist state. So if you moved here and thought we don't have tourism, I'm sorry, we have tourism. We're the Grand Canyon state. We're the number 1 or 2 destination in the United States for tourism. We're the number 1, number 2 destination in the world when they come to visit the United States. It's New York and Grand Canyon. So we're a tourist station. We're a tourist state. We're always going to be a tourist state. The other thing is the availability of housing. We've had housing crisis for 10 years. We were talking about it. So to say that short-term rentals are why we have a housing problem is not at all accurate. I would completely say it's overregulation, but that's a totally different topic. I also work in the hotel industry, so I laugh when we hear, well, the hotel industry is against it, and the hotel industry is so pure, and they do everything right, and then these short-term rentals people are coming in and they're destroying the hotel industry, and we're not going to have a lauded hotel industry anymore. Well, guess what, folks? Marriott's, the Hiltons of the world, they're getting into this space too. They have websites where they offer short-term rentals. So when they say oh, you're going to hurt us, no, they're in this space too. And all you have to do if you think they're so compliant is, it's with taxes and all that other stuff, is ask your local hotelier, what percentage of their business is cash. I guarantee that percentage is what they're not paying taxes on. So the hotel I work at, we're like 98% credit card. So we pay our taxes, but I guarantee some of the businesses, hotels that are like, oh, 50% of our business is cash, well, they're paying taxes on 50% of the credit cards, not their cash.
Sure. I'll just make one point, and that's on the housing affordability. So there's actually really good academic research on the impact of short-term rentals on housing affordability now. And just to give you one example, there was a study that came out last year from two professors, one at USC in LA and one from UCLA. It was backed by the National Bureau of Economic Research, which is sort of like the gold standard for academic research in economics. And what they concluded was a 10% increase in the amount of short-term rental listings. It results in a 0.42% increase in rents. And that was a national study. So if you now take and look at the growth of the industry, like 800% over the last 8 years, right? 0.42% for each 10% doesn't sound like a lot, but it's actually 24% potentially that could be attributed to this. So it is actually a real effect, and obviously you could always debate academic studies, and this is peer-reviewed, and everyone has the ability to audit the data. But the thing is, like, there's obviously opinions on that, but there's also data and research, and I recommend that anyone who wants to study this actually look at the research, because I think it's pretty conclusive by now.
Hi, I'm right here. I'm the mayor of Sedona.
There you go.
So yes, we're your poster child in Arizona. But there are other cities. Different cities have different problems. I actually have a question before that. When you count the units that you have when you're doing your data collection, it seems to me it's probably impossible to count in terms of actual number of rooms, because you rent a single-family unit. Do you count that as one, or do you say it's got 5 bedrooms? We count it as 5. Which do you do?
So the data I presented here was just the number of units. It was not bedrooms or beds. We could do that if we needed to, because that data is available. So we could actually tell you how many essentially beds are available.
Okay, because that, obviously that could lead to some misleading data out there if you're not really counting the number of rooms, and somebody's renting a house where there's 10 bedrooms versus somebody's renting a house where there's 1, how it's counted is going to make a real difference in the data you get.
Depending on what you're trying to analyze, if you're trying to do an analysis for tourist development purposes, I agree, but if you're just trying to figure out how many renters were potentially converted from long-term to short-term rentals, like, it doesn't really matter if it's 1 or 2 or 3 bedrooms. It depends on the question you're trying to answer.
Well,
Yeah.
I think it makes a difference. I mean, you could have, it's going to make a difference in how many cars are there, probably, and that sort of thing. We have traffic issues in Sedona, so that's one of the things. When it comes to collecting the emergency contact, which, we tried to do it by license, even when we required the license, and as long as we were able to, we had to take that back, but we didn't get everybody coming in and getting a business license, even though we sent out to every household in Sedona a request for anybody with a short-term rental to get a business license. We didn't get everybody coming back, and same thing with emergency contact. So I don't know how we can do that very effectively if we can't even figure out who to license. So,
I mean, just to address that, there is actually, we do that for 135 cities, and it works really good. We get about 86% compliance on our 2 letters. So it depends on how you write the letters. It depends on what you put in the letter. It depends on who you work with to do it. Some people are good at doing this. Some people are not so good at doing this. So it's a question of execution more than anything.
well, we were pretty careful about how we wrote the letter, but
Good.
The other thing I would say is in terms of the HOA piece you talked about, not everybody's in an HOA. So we maybe got at least half the city that's not in HOAs. So working with them isn't going to solve our problem. It might help. The real problem is we can't treat them as businesses, and they are businesses. So that's why we're working this year to try to change state law to do that, whereas we did the tax piece last year, and that'll be effective on January 1 of 19. So that will take care of that part of it. We'll be getting more of our taxes, but we still can't manage. We really need to be able to manage them. And we're powerless to do that right now because we can't differentiate between long-term and short-term rentals. And trying to apply it to everybody is just not going to work. It's just not going to work. We can't, I think there's a specific state law, correct me if I'm wrong, Linda or John, about we can't license long-term rentals. Yeah. So that makes it a little tough.
Thank you very much. Even when our state law says if you've got an HOA and in your CC&R it says you can't have short-term rentals, I know of several HOA neighborhoods where short-term rentals have sprung up, and they're basically saying you can't do that, and these corporations that bought these say, well, then sue us, and they don't have the funds to do that. So how does the HOA, fortunately, the HOA I'm in, we've got some funds if they have, but the others aren't that profitable or have that much reserves to say, yes, I am going to take you to court. So now what is the next step? Or there is no next step because legally suing was where they had an opportunity to address those issues. But you got these corporations, deep pockets, go ahead, try it. What's the
I mean, again, obviously, I'm trying to give you creative solutions to a problem that is very hard to solve. I'm not saying I have all the solutions because you really don't. The only solution you have is working with your state assembly to come up with reasonable rules. But I'm saying in the meantime, you could try these things. It won't work perfectly, as the mayor of Sedona pointed out, only half of the city is in HOAs. But maybe if you try to work with those HOAs, at least you solve the problem for half the city. Maybe, and then maybe some people will try to sue the HOAs and they may not work everywhere, but most people want to be good people. They don't really want to sue the HOAs. I do think that you can come a long way by trying to use the tools you have in the meantime until the state hopefully comes up with something that works better for everyone.
Bill Dyack, Mayor of Page. And, you know, it is in Arizona, it is a problem for everybody in the state. But it's a different problem for different communities. If you could put your slide back up there that showed the number of units in Arizona, I'd like to make a point along that line. In that you take that one right there, if you take let's take a Sedona, where it's a problem for Sedona, where it's listing 1,200 listings, or 794 units. And let's compare them, just go up the list there to Scottsdale, and you take the size of Scottsdale and its total population and what it is, and then Sedona's, the proportionate number of houses left for single-family residents is large. For Sedona, it might be 5 to 6% of their total homes are vacation home rentals. That's problematic. So now look across the other side of that on Page. You take Page, 206 units. That's 20% of our housing market. 20%. That's problematic. Whether or not you're a Tucson, or whether or not you're a Oro Valley, or whether or not you're a Paradise Valley. Fountain Hills, those are where there's big problems. If your population is already 1.5 million and you've got less than 1% of them are vacation home rentals, it's not necessarily problematic. But when it gets up there to 20% of your housing market eaten up in that's very problematic. So that's where I think I'm glad that the legislators will hopefully be looking at this, and we can come up with some type of compromise. It needs to be a plan that's working for everyone. So is there one size fits all? Probably not. But at least maybe some more local control where we can do what we feel is best for our individual communities is what we need to be looking for.
one hell of a reality check. You know you're in deep you-know-what when you turn to HOAs for help. I never thought I'd ever do that. I've been trying to kill them for the last 12 years. Just kind of another reality check. Don't underestimate the power behind this whole movement. I mean, 2 years ago, I think every representative in the House voted for this bill which protects them. In the Senate, the vote was 29-1. I was the only no vote. And that's only because I was born and raised in New York City. And the first thing I do when I look at a law is I say, how could I scam this? And I said, man, I can scam this baby 10,000 different ways. Governor Ducey showed a willingness to readdress the first problem that came up with respect to tax collection. I said, I want to run this bill. I know you were really for it. He goes, just check with the stakeholders, make sure you're not violating any agreements. And it went through smoothly. In terms of the future, you're not going to get the authority to do a San Francisco regulation. With the governor's office and the legislature solidly behind this concept, what we can do, and I think the governor's willing to do, is attack the real abuses. Go after the party houses, go after the investor owners who aren't residents that just want to make a little extra cash, and go after the ones that are purely commercial. So there'll be hope there, but don't expect too much, because we don't want to go back to the point where people are being unreasonably restricted. But the abuses, I think, we can deal with.
Hello. I'm a council member from Apache Junction, so we're a great winter visitor area. I also have a summer rental house in Prescott, so I've got a winter and a summer locations. I've also been a licensed realtor for 30 years. What is the average time frame do you have of these rentals? Is it typically a week, a weekend? Because Arizona real estate law has different effects on each length of term of what you can do or can't do in terms of evicting somebody. Are they usually just weekends, or are they more for a week at a time? Do you have an average?
Yeah, I mean, so the average, and it really depends on the area. Most places in like urban areas like Scottsdale and stuff like that, it would be about 4-day average duration. In more destination communities like Sedona or the ski resorts, winter resorts up by Flagstaff, it would be more like a week. Because it's really different uses. So I don't think you can say that there's like one standard is really a wide distribution, and it's not like a normal distribution. It's really different. Like sometimes it's really long, sometimes really short. Like in Phoenix, the average is probably about 2 nights because people come
But you
for
don't get a
conference.
30-day or a 14-day.
I mean, not very
typically.
often. No, that's not very typical. Like the vast majority of very short duration stays.
My question is, that's not a question, it's a statement from the mayor of Page. How many hotels have been promoted in the city of Page, and how much housing has been promoted in the city of Page in the last 15 years? I know of 7 hotels that have gone up and no housing projects. So that's maybe why the numbers are skewed.
I just wanted to thank you for providing some of this information in this context, because I know in the city that I'm from, we're dealing with this issue. And obviously there are private property rights that we have to contend with, but I think we have a number of residents who say, I live in a single family residential neighborhood and I want to see that respected too. I also have, my right to live in a neighborhood that I choose, and I should have my rights protected. So I definitely appreciate some of the information that you shared, that this sort of gives us some guidelines to move forward. It was really appreciated.
I'm with the Chamber of Commerce in Page, and as the mayor had spoke, the one thing I hope that legislators will do is, with our problem is we have no housing available for anybody. We cannot get teachers, doctors, We've got people coming in for seasonal work. There's no place to live. I just had a Park Service lady that was living in an RV, but it's in a restricted area and had to be moved. She had no place to go. Asked if she could take an RV and just go sit out somewhere out in the desert and park it. So I'm hoping that legislators really look at the fact that towns like ours that is small, right now we're about 8,500 on our population. We have to have some sort of regulation in there because everybody and their brother is doing it, along with all of the tour companies. They're renting out these places and bringing in 30, 40 people at a time.
Star Bearcat, Quartzsite, Arizona. Our problem is we have a lot of snowbirds. It's not a problem, but they bring us a lot of income. But they also own property, and they only are there for maybe 6 months, and they rent out their trailer spaces, you know, on that property. They aren't mobile home parks, so they aren't paying taxes, and it's a private property. We have 70 mobile home parks that are now hurting because over 100 properties are renting to non-family. Even though the code says your family can come visit for a short time, they're renting anywhere from a month to 6 months. And it's very difficult to enforce anything on them because they're private properties. They're a business, they're making money, and now some of them are starting to rent year-round on those properties. So what kind of solutions you got in mind on that?
That's a good question. I don't think it's a really short-term rental issue. It sounds like more of a long-term rental issue. It's specifically focused on people renting out, it sounds like, mobile home parking spaces, essentially. So I think you might want to disaggregate it from this particular issue, but I do think it's something that you need to talk to your state legislators about as well, because, to be honest, this is a very specific Arizona problem. I've never heard this problem anywhere else in the country. Oh, wow, yeah. So that happens too. Cool.
If I might, I'd just like to make a comment. My name is Alex Vidal. I'm a legislative associate with the League, so this is an issue that I've been working on with Senator Kavanaugh and others. I want to thank Ulrich for joining us and give us some information so that we're really approaching this in a holistic manner with good information. We're not just looking at anecdotes and individual locations. The plan is to try and do a hybrid so that individual communities can set some regulations that are reasonable and work for them, and then having the state collect and remit the taxes. So a renter would work with their individual city to make sure they're in compliance with the local rules, and then the system that we already have in place where an Airbnb or a VRBO would then get the tax license at the state level. So that way we're not doing the San Francisco model. It's just a simple, you go to your city, you get your permit, and then the platform would then go to the state and get your tax license. So that way we're not making it overly burdensome for folks that, the snowbirds or the folks that have it's their primary home, it's their secondary home, and we're really going after the problem homes that are repeat offenders. We're going after the investor homes that are swallowing up some of the housing.
Okay, thank you, Alex. All right, please join me in thanking Mr. Binzer for all this data. It's certainly going to be helpful for us going forward. And you have his contact information here if you wish to go ahead in that way. And I just want to remind you that the next round starts at 10 a.m., so refer to your app. And is that it? Okay. Thank you for coming.
And
yes.
maybe one last remark. If anyone is interested in getting a more specific analysis of their community, like I can give you my card, you can shoot me an email, and then I'm happy to send you more details. All right, that's even better. Thank you.
Perfect.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Oops. Sorry. Thanks so much.